Hello and welcome to Gearhead 704. I'm Matt, and this is actually a continuation video of the how to do your front brakes on your Foxbody Mustang video that I'm making here with Matt at Fox Mustang Restoration. In case you missed the first part, definitely check that out. I will have a link down to that video in the description below, so you can check that out. But yeah, right now we're gonna go ahead and pick up right where we left off from last time and get into this and finish this brake job. All right guys, got Matt on the floor here. If you're just catching up in this video, this is where we're packing the bearings. The races have already been installed, but maybe they didn't have to do that, Matt. Maybe they're bearing packing.
So here we are at the next step.
Yep.
There's a couple ways to pack a bearing. I prefer this one. It's called the easy squeeze because it's pretty easy. But all you do, you're gonna take your big bearing, taper down, drop it in there. Small bearing, taper down, tuck it inside the big bearing. Take your little plunger right here, put it on, then you're gonna push. And that's pushing a plunger down and pushing grease up through bearings, and it's actually packing the bearings full of grease. I'll stop right there so you can see. As I push down, you can see how it pushed the grease through all of the bearing spaces.
Yeah, and this you can pick up at an auto parts store too.
Yes, right? Yeah, all the auto parts stores carry this. I'm just gonna give it another little push because I like to make sure my bearings are full of grease.
Yeah, remember you have to push hard on that thing.
Yep, and there we go. So if you don't want to buy one of these, there's actually a way to pack bearings without one of these, and I will show you here in just a moment. All right, so this is a little bit of an old school way of packing bearings. So you take a bunch of grease, put it in your hand, put it in the palm of one of your hands, and then what you're gonna do is you're gonna take the bearing with the wide side of the taper, with the big gaps between the cage and the inner housing facing towards the grease. So what you're gonna do, you're gonna take it, put the hole into the grease and press down. It doesn't seem like it's doing much, but just keep doing that. The grease will come up through the rollers.
Sure enough,
and that part of the bearing is packed. So to pack the whole bearing, you just
turn it, huh?
Yeah, you just keep going until it's all packed. It doesn't take much, see? It's already packed all the way to here. So I'm gonna get a little bit of more grease here.
It's nice and easy, actually.
Yeah. See that one like really pushed out right there?
Yep. Right Big thing I noticed, it just takes a little bit more time.
Yeah, just a little bit more effort, a little bit more time, but it's still easy. But there you go. Pretty much packed the whole bearing right there, maybe a little bit left to go, and there we go. Got a packed bearing without a bearing packer.
All right, so now that we got the bearings packed and we got, in your case, the races replaced, we're ready to go back on the car, I believe, right?
Almost. We got to put the back bearing or the inner bearing into the rotor, and that gets mounted in with the seal that's pressed in. So the bearing goes in and then the seal presses into the rotor and holds that bearing on. But what we want to do first is make sure that our brand new rotor has a good amount of grease in it. So behind the bearing race, there's a little, I guess, valley you could call it. I just like to pretty much fill that up with grease. Just a little bit of an excess. Make sure you get some grease on the race. You don't want a dry start. You always want to make sure there's enough lubrication there. Got that. I'll take my bearing that I packed with the actual packer. I'll take some of the extra. I'm going to wipe it. Put a good coating on the outer rollers, or the outside of the rollers. So now we got a good covering on the outside, and we're packed solid full of grease on the inside. So that is a completely packed bearing. Drop that in. I usually like to give it one little wipe like that. Now you're gonna take your seal, and your seal just hammers in. Got our grease seal, the wheel bearing grease off of that outer edge of the rotor. You're usually gonna have a flange right here. You can see how it's thinner on the inside and you got this lip. The lip's gonna go on the top, so the thin part's gonna go into the rotor. So it's gonna go into the rotor like that. And this one, you wanna do a little bit different than the race. I usually kinda start with this one a little bit cocked in the rotor. So I'll start with one side down a little bit. I'll hold that side down, and then I'll start hitting the side that's raised up. And right there, it's installed. Once you get started, you just work it around the edge, and there you go.
Didn't take as much effort with that.
Right. Actually, before we go put it on the car, we'll flip it over. We'll make sure that the front race is greased, then we'll put the bearing in, and then we'll go ahead and go mount the rotor onto the car.
Okay, so we've got a rotor with new races, packed bearings, and ready to be installed, I believe. Is that right, Matt?
Yep. So we got a new cotter pin. Always use a new one. Don't reuse the one that was all bent up that you took out.
Especially with all the weight of the car being on that.
Exactly. That's one thing to think about as well. Absolutely. So one more thing with the grease. we wiped our spindle off. Well, again, we need to make sure everything's greased up, so we're just gonna put a nice coating of grease on this spindle hub. Done with grease finally, at least for this side. The rear bearing is held in with the seal. It's not gonna go anywhere. The front bearing is just set into the race, nothing holding it on, because if you remember, the nut and the washer is what held that bearing into the rotor. So the way that I do it is I got both bearings installed. I'm gonna grab the rotor like this, hold the bearing in with my thumbs, but I'm gonna put this washer there first. But the reason I hadn't done that yet, I wanna show you, you notice there's a tab on the inside of this washer. There's a groove on the spindle. So when you put this on, you need to make sure after you put the rotor and the bearings on, you put the outer bearing on, the next is this washer. It goes in that notch like that, and will actually sit up against that bearing. We're gonna go ahead and install it and you'll see how it goes. So put the washer on top of the outer bearing. I'm gonna hold it all together with my hands.
You gotta pay attention to the way the rotor's coming in.
Yep. And then I slide it all as an assembly. I line up that tab, then push it all the way on. And I've already wiped all this stuff down after I took it off initially. Now we're gonna thread the nut on. At this point, we're gonna set the bearings. So for that, you need a set of channel locks. Set it for the nut so you got a nice comfortable grip on the nut. You're gonna tighten it up a little bit, a little snug. You're gonna spin the rotor. Tighten and loosen the nut as I spin, and that already went in about 1/8 more turn than it did before. That's making sure the bearings are set into the race and everything is sitting on the spindle properly. So as I'm spinning it, I tighten and loosen that nut just like that. And being that everything's new on this, I'm really giving it a good set. It's getting pretty tight. I'm compressing the bearing pretty well, but right now I'm gonna say we're set. You saw I spun that quite a lot, back and forth on the nut. The nut is really tight now. We don't want it that tight because too tight on the nut means the preload on the bearings too much. These bearings are not made to do that, so that will cause some overheating. So what I do is I take the nut, after it's tight, I'll loosen it up till it's just barely loose. So right here, it's probably, yeah, finger loose. So right there is as tight as I can get it with my fingers. I'll go just a little tiny bit just to snug it up. Then you take your castle crown here. The cotter pin hole goes from top to bottom. And the reason this is set like this is so you can set this in different positions. So you see where I just put it on, that tang is covering up the cotter pin hole. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna rotate it 1 notch. Now it's lined up. Drop the cotter pin in. Grab your side cutters, and I usually set it to where the eye is not like this. I set it to where the eye is facing me, or the eyelet's facing me. I wrap that around, the other side, wrap it around, cut off the excess. And now your rotor's installed with new bearings. Last thing you gotta do, take your little cap, hammer it back into place. And here's the thing about these caps. A lot of times they get worn out from being hammered in so many times. You can see this one's dinged pretty good. This one is just going in and out like nothing. So a couple of things here. If this is from people hammering this in the past, if this is dented in, it's possible for it to hit your cotter pin and it'll go ting, 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 ting. If that's the case, just get a new cap, or if you want to, hit that one out. This one's not fitting real tight, it'll fall off. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try just striking it once on the top against the ground to try to take that circle and make it a little oblong, and that should hold it in there.
Massage it.
There you go, just massaging it. And now, it's tight. And now,
that's a nice little easy fix.
Now I can't get it off. Yeah. So, there we go. You spin it, as long as you don't hear that tick, 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 your cotter pin's clear of your cap, and that rotor is fully installed, and we're ready to put the pads back on.
All right, so we're about ready to install the caliper and the pads. Matt's got the bolts here, so they look a little dirty, I guess. Yeah, a little dirty. So if you'll notice, it's kind of a weird bolt. You see, it's kind of shiny right here, and a little shiny right here. And you've got your threads. Well, the threads obviously is what bolts the caliper pin to the spindle. But your caliper will actually slide. Your caliper doesn't bolt on tight. As your pads wear out, that caliper has to change position. So it's actually a caliper slide bolt. So once this is installed back, especially with the piston compressed, we should be able to go like this with the caliper, and it should slide on those slides. But to make sure it slides properly, I'm gonna go clean these up with the wire wheel, clean the old Loctite off the threads, lube up the slide pins, and we're gonna go ahead and get it installed. All right, so we got the rotor installed. Let's go ahead and get the pads onto our caliper. So the caliper piston is still extended some, so we need to compress that in all the way to make sure that we're gonna have enough room for our new pads to fit, because obviously, or hopefully, our new pads are much thicker. So we need to move that piston in so everything can fit within there. So I'm gonna take the old pad
I'm gonna put the old pad back into the piston, and the reason I'm doing this is to compress the piston. I use a pair of channel locks, which go against the pad and the back of the caliper. I'm just gonna squeeze. It takes a lot of pressure. It goes pretty slowly because you're actually pushing all the hydraulic fluid back up to the master cylinder. If you've recently refilled your master cylinder is gonna be much higher than it should be. The reason it's too low is because the fluid that was within the master cylinder is now behind the piston. It takes up that space as the piston moves out. So as you're compressing this, you're pushing the fluid back up through the master cylinder, and it's very common if that happens, as you're compressing this, you're gonna start seeing brake fluid drip out underneath the car. Don't worry about it. It's just because there was too much brake fluid in there. Once you get the brake job done, you'll pump the pedal and make sure everything's good, and then recheck your brake fluid level, and then top it off if needed. You can see once the piston's in all the way, it'll actually be almost completely flush with the dust boot here. Now we'll go ahead and install our new pads.
These NOS pads as well, Ford pads.
Yeah, Ford pads, man.
Very cool.
Yeah, I like to make sure I only do the job once. On the brake pads, at least on the inboard pads, there is a left and a right indicated. You can see an R there for right, L for left. Left is driver, right is passenger. On the outboard pad, there's nothing indicating it. So, I'm sorry, no, this is the inboard, this is the outboard. So the outboard matters, the inboard doesn't matter. We want to try to eliminate the brake squeal. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. You hit the brake, get this loud squealing. It's usually because the brake pads need to be lubricated. The backside of the brake pad needs to have a slight bit of lubrication. The other method to do it is to actually glue it. There's a quiet stop stuff that's orange, a lot of people seen. It basically glues the pad to the piston and the caliper. The other way to do it, which is the way that I prefer, you can use brake caliper grease or brake grease. I just use dielectric, of course.
Of course.
Yeah, so I just put a little bit. So this is the inboard pad. The piston goes over this, so the piston's gonna make contact in this area here. So I'll put a little bit of dielectric here, a little bit of dielectric here. And on the outboard pad, the caliper is gonna come into contact between this clamp and the pad on both sides. So I'll lube here and lube here. Not a whole lot, grease goes a long way. So these pads were nice, and most pads will do this as well. You can see that this black piece right here is a shim. That is also meant to help with the brake squeal noise or to reduce it. So with the brake shim and a bit of lubrication, you can pretty much guarantee you're not gonna have any type of brake squeal noise. And of course, if you're doing this, you got grease on your finger, don't touch the front of the pad because then you're really lubricating your brakes.
Yeah.
To put these pads in, you have to put the inboard in first because of these tangs. They are so tall that if we had the outboard pad installed, we would not be able to fit this in here. So inboard first, those 3 tangs go inside that piston, and make sure, you see that one popped on the outside, make sure you, if that happens, don't press into it because you're gonna poke that seal and you're gonna break that dust seal, which is gonna let contaminants into your piston seal. All right, so once that's lined up, you just snap it into place. There's one. Take our outboard, make sure it's L for left. Push on just like that. Real quick, I'm gonna tell you that this lip here and this lip here actually slides next to lips or guides in the spindle. So if it doesn't go in first, you may have to kind of look back here and straighten that pad up. Once it gets straightened, it'll go all the way on. So the thing we need to do is bolt it on.
Yeah,
so,
you did take these to the wire wheel, right?
Took in a wire wheel, cleaned them up. This one, we're gonna do a combination of grease and Loctite. We're gonna grease where it's smooth here, also on this large shoulder.
Skip the threads, basically.
Yep, don't grease the threads. What we're gonna do with the threads, that's where we're actually gonna put a drop of Loctite. I've only got red Loctite. This stuff holds really, really tight. So on something like this, you don't want the you don't want the bolts coming out, so you want a little bit of extra protection. But if you're using red Loctite, literally a small dab like that's plenty.
Is blue what you'd rather use?
Blue is what I'd rather use, but I'm out of it right now. Loctite on the threads, greased on the slides, and now we're gonna slide it through the pad. I kind of use the bolt to line up the pad with the hole in the spindle. So I'll show you this first. You notice you got this bushing right here. So the bolt goes through the pad, into the bushing, and this is where the slide action comes into play. So as the caliper moves, it will be able to slide on that bolt like that. So we'll slap this back in, put this through. Make sure you go through the pad, the spindle, and then the back of the caliper. And a lot of times, this has a very large shoulder on it, so a lot of times you gotta move that to be able to get that bolt through the pad all the way. you don't want the bolt to bind, or that shoulder of the bolt to bind on the pad. So if the slides aren't working and the caliper's frozen in place, what's the only other part that can move is gonna be the piston. So the piston's gonna keep pushing that inboard pad, and as it wears, nothing's really gonna wear here. And the other thing it does, if your calipers are sticking or your brakes are sticking for any reason, when you hit the brakes, the car's gonna yank to that side. Because if one side is braking more than the other, the car's gonna pull to that side. So the more the yank, when you hit the brakes, other side is sticking.
Okay.
So typically, if it pulls to the right, the left
before.
side is sticking. Yeah, it can be caused by a couple of things. Collapsed brake hose, not allowing hydraulic pressure to go to the caliper. Seized caliper piston, where the piston just doesn't move anymore. And at that point, either a clogged hose or a collapsed hose or a frozen piston, you have no braking action on that side at all. If the calipers froze up, that's when you're gonna get just the inboard pad wearing, and it's still gonna yank to one side. But those are the three issues that could cause your brakes or your caliper to not function or seize up. We're just gonna thread these in, and then I'm gonna go get the torque specs, and we'll tighten those up, and then we'll check to make sure the slide's working, make sure nothing's hung up, and then we should be good.
Matt found his trusty torque wrench and got the specs. And
yep, we're looking at, it says 30 to 40 foot-pounds, so I'm gonna go with 40 because, you know, it's brakes. And when you're threading this in, again, you wanna make sure that this big shoulder on this bolt goes through the pad.
Doesn't bind up, right?
And doesn't get caught on the backside, because if you look right here, that bolt has a pretty good shoulder right there, and if it gets caught on the front of that pad, then it can actually bend the pad. So we got these torqued down, and the last thing we want to check for function is the caliper. So if you come over here, the reason we lubed up those slides is we want to be sure that this caliper is allowed to move in and out. So before you press on your brake pedal, which pumping the brake pedal is what will push the piston back out and make the pads come in contact with the rotor. But before you do that, with the piston still compressed, we want to make sure we have that movement back and forth. So just, there we go. So now that we know that the caliper is nice and loose and it slides, everything's functioning properly, last thing to do after you do the other side, obviously, let the car down. And then at that point, you're going to push the brake pedal, and you're going to push it as far as it'll go. It'll probably go to the floor. You keep doing that. If it goes to the floor 2 or 3 more times, don't worry about it. You're just gonna keep doing it until the pedal gets hard, and then it's gonna start staying up like normal brake pedal. The reason you're doing that is as you're pushing down, it's pushing fluid out of that master cylinder into this caliper and moving that piston out. Because the piston is moving out and it hasn't came into contact with the rotor, meaning that it's gonna stop, you're not getting any resistance at the pedal. So once that piston gets all the way out and those pads are being compressed against the rotor, that's when the fluid can't move any further, and you're going to hit the brake pedal, and it's going to come down just a little bit and stop. And the way that the calipers are designed, whenever you do have it completely together and everything's working properly, when you hit the brake pedal on normal braking and you let off, this system is actually designed to actually suck the piston in just a tiny bit. And the reason it does that is that keeps your brakes from actually dragging, or the pads from dragging, whenever your foot is not on the brake or whenever you're not trying to activate the brakes. But as long as you got a good brake pedal after putting the brakes together, then check your fluid level on your master cylinder, and if that's good, put your tires on and take her for a drive.
That's simple, Matt.
Yeah, that's simple. And you know, this is that thing where I always say it's like the simple jobs are always more complicated than you think if you want to do them correctly.
Yeah.
So,
another way of saying that is the details matter, right?
Exactly. Thank you. Yes, the details absolutely matter. You got to cover every functioning angle of a job that you're working on. You can't shortcut, you can't skip over stuff, because when you do, it's going to cause problems that you may not even realize are going to happen.
Uneven pad wear, brake systems falling off.
Right, you got
cotter pin's kind of important, right?
Exactly. So, proper bearing torquing, proper bearing lubrication, all that fun stuff.
Well, good deal.
Yep.
All right, well, we completed the brake job, and hopefully it helped you guys. Definitely thanks to, I think we're going with, not the Fox Doc, Dr. Foxbody is what I'm calling you now sometimes.
Yeah. What you call me?
Yeah. Fox Doc was taken, so thank you.
I'll answer to it.
All right, well, he answers anything. Thank you, Dr. Foxbody. Thank you, the assistant Tyson. And yeah, we're going to close this one out, but thanks a lot, Matt.
Yeah.
And hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, we have a lot of other how-tos here on the channel, so subscribe if you haven't already for those. And if you give me a like, I'd appreciate it, because that helps me out a lot. And that's pretty much it. We'll see you here next time on Gearhead 704.